Welcome to Diabreadic, the podcast where a T1D artist and a T1D expert come together to bake some bread, and then we break bread with smart and interesting people as we talk through the human in health and technology. I'm Stephen Horrocks, PhD and expert in experiences with diabetes and devices.
And I'm Melissa Horrocks. I am a T1D artist, baker, and creator of all things.
And this episode, we have mini garlic naan and a fantastic discussion with Dr. Carrie Rentschler from McGill University. We're going to be talking about a lot of things, but there are a lot of conversations about the way that devices communicate information to people with diabetes and everybody else and how we negotiate it.
Yeah, it was a really great conversation. I'm excited for everyone to have a listen.
So join us.
Welcome back. We are talking about our mini garlic naans that we made. They were really good. I'm going to turn it to you because you know everything about it and I know nothing.
That's not true. You know what it was like to eat them.
We always joke about I'm just the taste tester.
We come together to bake bread. Sometimes we come together to bake bread, but we also just enjoy it together. So as far as I'm concerned, that's good enough.
Part of the greatness of bread.
That's right.
Bringing everyone together.
Everyone together. That's why we're
not
doing
everyone.
The podcast. Not everyone. Actually, that'll be part of our conversation a little bit later. But this recipe is based off of the garlic naan recipe by Chef John Mitzowich. He runs the Food Wishes.
I was going to say foodwishes.com.
From foodwishes.com. With
oh man,
garlic
I've teased
naan.
Steve so many times because I hear that. Chef John has become a part of our family, it feels. I
Listen.
hear his voice coming from the kitchen when Steve's doing dishes, watching
That's right.
Chef John.
That's right. I mean,
He's amazing.
He exists in our home. Okay, he's part of our home and our kitchen. Honestly, though, if you're
listening, John, we love you.
oh yeah, please, would you? I mean, I'm going to tag you. So, I mean, you probably don't check Instagram though. If you're not familiar with Chef John or Food Wishes, I do highly recommend the Food Wishes YouTube channel and foodwishes.com, or it's a blog spot, I think still, but he is super quirky. He's got a lot of idiosyncrasies. And in the way he speaks, the way that he presents the information, and it's fantastic. But he is a pretty brilliant cook.
Yeah.
And even more so, he's really good at communicating the process without making it all jargony and inaccessible. And I have,
or just
over the years,
irritating. Some of the YouTube channels, you're just like, they have to have some gimmick or something. And I mean, he has his, like, the way he speaks and stuff that makes him who he is and his videos who he is. But I don't know. He doesn't have those same irritating.
Yeah, I mean, folks listening might have an idea of kind of the stereotypes of YouTubers, quote unquote. And there's a lot of these kind of, adolescent joking styles that get a lot of clicks and a lot of views. And so when channels start to grow and they start to see what kinds of content is creating those clicks that result in their money making, they lean in. And I'm not going to, name any names there, but there are times when I have really enjoyed a channel and then kind of lost interest because of the way the content's presented. It's really hard. But
anyway,
there are a lot of people, frankly, who, like Melissa, have certain aversions to the way that Chef John talks too. So, take it for what it is. Anyway, back to the bread. There are a couple of things with this recipe that I think are pretty key that worked out really well and helped produce what was a really kind of soft and fluffy, but like chewy exterior in these mini naan breads. And the mininess, I think, is really fun.
Oh, just little pillows.
That's right. So a couple of keys to the recipe itself. The yogurt is key to the texture and flavor of naan. And you can make naan without it. There are a lot of vegan naan recipes, but it does actually help produce a lot of the textural and flavor components that you expect from naan, if you're familiar in whatever context. And the other thing too is ghee or clarified butter for after they are cooked. The difference there is basically whether or not you brown the butter solids after you have clarified it. You boil it for a little bit.
You want to explain to people what that means?
Oh, sure.
I don't think I knew what clarified butter was until like a year or two ago. And actually, we were talking about it with my brother, who clarifies butter when he's making popcorn and stuff like that. So,
yeah.
Hey, Marcus.
The main idea there is if you heat butter past a certain point, the fats and the what they call the milk solids or the proteins and that kind of stuff, they separate. And so you can actually see the liquidy, yellowy stuff. And then the whitish solid pieces that drop to the bottom of a pot. If you put it in a pot and heat it up, that's clarified butter. That's as far as it needs to go because you have removed the milk solids, and that's the stuff that burns. So clarified butter has a super high smoke point, so you can use it in a lot of different ways of cooking. And the difference between clarified butter and ghee is that if you then continue to cook those milk solids, they will start to brown, and you get some really complex, nutty kind of flavors and
so
aromas
delicious.
that work their way into the milk fats that's clarified sitting at the top there. And it is super good. And it is a key to a lot of South Asian and Indian cuisines. So if you can make ghee, it's super easy. It only takes like 10 or 15 minutes. But you got to keep an eye on it as it browns, and that's about it. But you brush it on after they are cooked. And the fun thing about naan, and this is true with a lot of flatbreads.
Is there only one fun thing about naan?
You know what? That's a good point. There are multiple fun things about this naan because these are mini. And that's
everything's better small.
Yeah.
Tiny things are just cute.
Cute, way more fun as far as I'm concerned. But the process involved in cooking flatbreads makes it a lot less time consuming than a lot of other breads. And so you get that bulk rise, and then you just roll them out and slap them on a dry pan, really hot dry pan. They cook, you flip it over, seriously like 2 minutes each side or so. And that's about it.
Brush the butter on.
And then you pull them
garlic.
off and brush on that butter.
Garlic
in this case
infused.
with garlic. Yeah. And it's super delicious. There's one last component here that I think helps a lot with aesthetics. Doesn't add a ton to the flavor, but a little bit maybe. And that's some cilantro.
Yeah, we should have tried some with and without because I don't feel. I mean, I like cilantro. I'm not one of those people who taste soap.
Right.
But it's not like I want like big pieces of it on top of salads or things like that. But I didn't think it. I mean, it didn't deter me to have it on there. So
yeah. And one of the little tips that Chef John talks through in his recipe video is that he likes to like chop up those cilantro leaves just a little bit and then sprinkle them on top of the bread on each of these naan pieces right at that last moment before he finishes rolling it out, so that when he cooks it in the pan, for one thing, it sticks to the bread itself and it's not just part of the butter, but you also then get a little bit of charring and that kind of stuff. So it's really kind of aesthetically pleasing.
Steve's talking about burning again.
Let's not.
I got a lot of flack from that. I like brown things.
You're right.
I like the taste of browned things.
That's right.
But there's a fine line.
And listen, folks, okay, that whole conversation last time led to some blowback here, where it's like, oh, Melissa doesn't like food that's cooked. They're like, no, that's not true.
We had a whole family text thread about bacon and just...
Yeah, it went off the rails. But anyway, these his recipe produces what would, I guess you would consider kind of a classically sized naan. We divided that up into like 3 each. And it created these little, I don't know, 3 or 4 inch long mini naans that were just perfect for dipping. And they turned out fantastic. So I highly recommend. We're going to link the recipe blog post probably rather than the YouTube channel itself so that you can go and check it out and bake this yourself.
Let us know what you think.
Our guest today is Dr. Carrie Rentschler. She's an associate professor in the Department of Art History and Communication Studies at McGill University. She's also an associate member of the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies there. She has published widely in relation to feminist movements, especially how those movements respond in relation to gender violence, and unpacks a lot of the political implications of that, both online and IRL. She also has been writing and publishing and working on questions related to type 1 diabetes and technology. And we're very happy to have her on the show. Dr. Rentschler, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Steve.
First and foremost, we always like to start out by asking guests, what is your relationship with bread, and what is your relationship with diabetes?
First of all, love the questions. And I'll start with the bread one, though,
Yes.
The bread and diabetes one are related.
Certainly.
As those of us with type 1 know that, right?
Yes.
I'd say I have a long and intimate relationship with both bread and diabetes. I've always loved bread, love the smell of, bread in the oven. It's just so good. I've never been good at making yeast bread, I'll say, but my partner's really good at it. So he makes the yeast bread.
That's kind of nice, right?
I know.
Yeah.
And I'm the quick bread lady, basically. I can make a good banana bread and, pumpkin muffins and those sorts of things. So can he as well. But, that's interesting that, that question about bread is always a charged one, I think, for a lot of people, too.
Yeah.
And I grew up in the United States.
Okay.
And moved to Montreal in 2004 at the height of the Atkins diet, phenomena, let's call it, which was really anti-carb, right? It was all about not eating carbohydrates. Yeah, exactly. To lose weight. I knew a lot of people who were doing it. It was actually, working for them. And it was really, kind of interesting to witness. But at the same time, there was just this kind of backlash against bread. I mean, seriously, I'd call it a backlash. Bread was immoral in some ways. There was a very much immoral.
Demonized.
Discourse. Yeah, very demonized. And then when I moved to Montreal is this bread-loving, bread-celebrating city.
Oh.
Right. And it has when we moved here, we were kind of coming at this point where, all these fantastic bakeries had just been open for a few years. And that's just expanded from now. And even in the past 2 years, 3 bakeries have opened up in the neighborhood where I live.
Oh, yeah.
Which is very exciting. Very exciting for this household. So it was such a treat to move to a place where people actually liked bread and didn't think it was a bad thing. And, there's a kind of anti-carb sentiment that's been around a long time in the States, I would say, too. I'll tell one really short story about this. I was, when I was in grad school, I was in the women's locker room, after a swim. And, I'm just getting dressed, but I'm eavesdropping on a group of younger women who are also in the locker room. And one had brought a loaf of bread to share with her friends. And I think it was her grandma or her mother had made it and sent it as a gift. Here's a little treat for you. Right. And she was offering it to her friends, and her friends were like, oh, I can't eat that. Right, that's bread. I can't eat that. It's going to mess up my diet. It's something I simply won't put in my body.
Right.
And at that point, I stopped listening because I was so unhappy to hear that.
Triggered.
Especially when someone's, it's exactly like a trigger. When someone's offering you fresh baked bread, from a family member, and you refuse the invitation, right? I was like, oh man, something's very wrong here. Something's so wrong here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, I'm sure this intersects with a lot of your work in relation to feminist studies and gender studies in general, because there's a lot of history behind why American culture produces such problematic relationships with food in general, but particular ones, like you said, bread in particular.
Yeah. So. Yeah. That eating is a moral, right, is a moral issue.
Right.
It's like deeply moral in the U.S. and it's not so moral here in Montreal and Canada, I would say. I've only lived in Montreal in Canada.
Yeah.
But it's just not the same. And it really changes, how you think about and relate to food as a result. Yeah. Something I've, loved all of my life. I've always loved to eat. And taken great pleasure in eating. So it's like, I live in a place where people take pleasure in food.
This is a thing. Yeah.
And it's amazing, right?
Yes.
It's not this like moral, conundrum in terms of like, what am I going to eat? Because eating is seen as bad somehow, right? As sort of morally suspect. I mean, we might have moral questions about food that are about like, how's it grown? And, who's growing it and how are they treated? And, those sorts of things. But this other dimension around sort of embodiment and, gender and race and class and all of that kind of, gets targets particular people for extra surveillance, I would say, around what they're eating and how they're eating.
For sure.
And of course that has implications for folks with diabetes as well, because we're already, surveyed in many ways. It's kind of monitored, right, in our lives, both by caregivers, but also just other people in our lives, right? Because it's all about managing, what we're eating and, how we're treating our disease, right?
For sure.
I can answer that question about diabetes too, in relationship to this, if that seems all right.
Absolutely.
I mean, I've lived with diabetes. Actually, this month, January, is my diabetes anniversary. We'll call it. I was diagnosed in January of 19. Yes, exactly. I was diagnosed back in January of 1973. So it's been 49 years, and I'm 50.
Yeah.
So I was one when I was diagnosed, and I don't really know anybody else who was diagnosed that young. I know someone else who was diagnosed at age 3, which is very close. Also a toddler, right? Mm-hmm. Or babyish. So my whole life I've has been diabetic, basically. Yeah. I've always identified with diabetes because it's what I've known my entire life. So I also say I have a long and intimate relationship with diabetes because it's really all I know in terms of what it is to live in this body. And that's really different, I think, from folks who are diagnosed a bit later, as preteens and as teens. And of course, we're seeing diagnosis ages, much older as well at this point.
Definitely.
In terms of type
20s,
1
30s,
diabetes.
40s. I've talked with people in their 40s and 50s who were diagnosed very late in life. And, what's interesting about that, in part, is a lot of those people, if they had been diagnosed 10 years ago, there wouldn't be a conversation. They would just be diagnosed type 2, and there would be no kind of exploration of what's happening in their particular body, right? Because of these associations with age. And these diagnoses.
Yeah, right. The difference between type 1 and type 2 being what age are you, right? Rather than what is actually going on in your body, right? Yeah. Not producing insulin, right? Versus maybe overproducing and not being able to absorb insulin, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, that's really interesting because I don't have diabetes, and my spouse and partner, Melissa, who I co-host this podcast with, does, and she was diagnosed when she was 9, and so this is kind of in that age range you're talking about right there in the middle, where she does have memories of life before diagnosis, but pretty much her whole life has been, right? And so there's a weird tension there because there's always this before, and that gets really messy when we start to think about this in academic terms, right?
Well, absolutely.
The before
and
the after.
Ways, and how that shapes people's, the meaning they make of their disease and how they're supposed to think about it. Because at that point, too, that point of diagnosis is okay, now you are this. You are diabetic. And here's how you need to think about this. Here's what you need to do. Here's what all the issues are. And of course, you typically get this litany of like all of the complications that you might face, right, at a certain point with type 1 diabetes. Type 2 as well. We share a lot of the same complications, which makes sense. But that, I think, is this kind of, for a lot of people, probably quite traumatic. So it wasn't traumatic for me as a person because I didn't know. I had no idea what was going on. I can't get into my mind as a 1-year-old, right? I can't get back to that. So like my diagnosis story is really my parents' story of diagnosis. And like, mostly my mom has told me about it. Yeah. How scared they were and how terrified, right? Because I mean, I'm so young. And my mother's sister was a type 1 diabetic who actually died the same year I was born. Wow. So it was like, I'm sure that shaped kind of powerfully the ways in which she was thinking about what it would mean to have a daughter with type 1 diabetes. Right. So, I have this baby book from my mother. She gave it to me a few years ago. And it's like, that's where the story of my diagnosis is located. You got the picture of me in the hospital, right? The little sort of bit of documentation about it, the local news story of who's in the hospital. Carrie Rentschler is, at St. Luke's Hospital.
In the newspaper, that's
Sioux City, Iowa. Didn't say I was diabetic, but that I was in the hospital. Which
Sioux City
tells you a little bit about.
That's one of those things that, frankly, that's one of those losses as local papers have been taken over by the conglomerates. You don't have this kind of narrative being publicly produced about the community and stuff. So but the fact that was, you have this kind of documentation, but not the personal memory. And as I've talked with Melissa, she has a lot of personal memory and, interestingly, not a whole lot of the physical documentation. And so she doesn't have like photos in there. She has vivid memories of being in the hospital, but no photos there. And, remembers the nurse and the nurse's name, but doesn't have any kind of like written communicate, any of that kind of stuff with them. So, so that's a really interesting kind of.
It's very different, because I'm looking at someone else's records of me rather than my own memory of it. It's like someone else has recorded this. I don't even know who took a photo of me in the hospital. I need to ask my parents, like, did you take that? When I was crying, I was like crying in this crib, right? Like I'm miserable. It's a photo of me being miserable. So I always look back at that, like that's the picture of my diagnosis is me crying in a crib in a hospital in Sioux City, Iowa.
That's wild.
And thinking about, wow, that kind of captures it, especially for them. Especially for them trying to, think about, what their role then was going to be in terms of, raising a daughter with diabetes. And really training me by age 9. By age 9, I was giving my own injections. Yeah. Because I really didn't like other people. I did not like my parents giving me my injections. And they, of course, were most concerned that, I needed to learn how to take care of myself. Right. Right. And like to do all of this treatment management myself. And I was more than happy to take that over from them. Because I was like, great. Give me control.
Little power
of
struggle
this
going on.
Yeah, right? Exactly. They were more than happy. They're like, great, because you are miserable when we, give you your injections. So let's make this a more pleasant experience for everyone.
No kidding. So, and that's an interesting point because one of the things that is unique about having been diagnosed so young is that you have basically your entire lifelong history with treatments, and those treatments have changed dramatically since the 1970s, right?
Oh my gosh, totally dramatically. I started with urine testing. Yeah. Right. When I was in 73, up until 1981, I started testing blood in 1981. And it was with chem strips, so it was you had your pricker, and then you had these sticks that you brought out, and you put the blood on it, and there's a chemical reaction. And what it would do is give you, again, a color range to tell you, well, you're testing between
here and here,
whatever it was, like 80
you have your little
and,
card for reference,
150, exactly. Prior to that, it was like you had a test tube. Well, first you had tape. You had test tape, which was actually a chemically treated piece of tape that you would pee on. And you see what color it would turn, it would do the same thing.
Yeah.
And then there were like a chemistry, what was it called? It was related to, it was like it wasn't chem sticks, it was something else.
The dextro sticks?
What was prior? They were these tablets. I actually had like a little science set in the bathroom, basically, with a little test tube. And I'd, put a chemical tablet in, and I'd put some urine drops on it, and it'd fizz up. It was very exciting, actually.
Yeah.
It was like I was doing an experiment. Like, what color? What color? Always hoping it would be like a lower, right? Like a low color. Can't even remember. I think it was like from blue to orange or something like that.
That's what I was going to ask, is how they coded the color.
Yeah, I was trying to remember.
There have been a few of these kind of scales that they used color coding, and some had a scale between like red and yellow or brown and yellow, but others had blues and reds. And
these were blues. Yep.
Blues. So was blue the low end and red was the high end?
I'm trying to remember.
Well, I'll have to go and look it up.
One of them being the opposite, like the darker blue meant. I probably have a photo of this somewhere on my computer too.
Yeah.
But I think for one the blue was high, but I think at one point maybe the yellow or the orange was higher.
Interesting.
Anyway, you kind of there was this like color scheme.
Yeah.
That became can you even call that a measure? I mean, it's really interesting, right? Because it's a color. It's not a single number, right?
Yeah.
And the color is meant to represent something that's just like, this quite broad range that today just sounds, kind of like it's totally imprecise.
That wouldn't be
There is no
useful.
Precision. Yeah, I know. You're sort of like, well, you're high. We don't know exactly how high your blood sugar is, or well, it's not even your blood sugar because it's the sugar in your urine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's delayed.
So that's the other thing.
So you were
it's delayed.
high.
Yes. Like how long ago?
Yeah.
Where's my body at now? How high is it now? Right. So there's the kind of the medium of what we've tested over time has really changed. I mean, the last change for me, so urine to blood was 1981.
Yeah.
I actually wrote an essay about the significance of that shift in my life for my college entrance essay.
Really?
When I was an undergraduate.
That's amazing. I hope you still have copies of that.
That's
so great.
If I do, but it was just like, they're like, talk about, an important moment in your life or something. It's like, well, here it is. Maybe not what you were expecting, but there you go.
BG meter.
And then, and then up until, really like 2020, when I started using the pump I'm using now, which is a tandem insulin pump, and now I use a continuous glucose monitor all the time. And I almost never test my blood sugar. And so now I test my interstitial fluid, right? Sort of, it's like fluid, under the skin, basically, which is also delayed as well. So it's like we've gone from urine delay to blood being like, that's exactly where you're at that moment, to another kind of delay through interstitial fluids. But there's so many benefits to continuous glucose monitoring. Yeah. But in 2020, my mind was blown again because I wasn't pricking my finger. And, from 1981 till 2020, I was pricking my finger multiple times a day. Yeah. From like 4 times up to, if it's a really bad day, 10 times, right?
Yeah, right.
To see where things were at. So I was like, oh my God, that just like changed my life again. It was this other kind of moment of changing my life. But it's right. Over these almost 50 years, I've sort of lived with different diabetes technologies, right? And like as diabetics, we do diabetes with technologies, right? Like that's it, with insulin delivery devices, with ways of measuring the sugar in our bodies, and that has totally changed since 1973.
Yeah.
So different.
You mentioned all those finger pricks. How are your fingertips now? So you've kind of eased off of that for like a year and a half now, right?
Yeah, that's right. Very smooth. They don't have the little tiny, these kind of tiny, almost callus-like things. And of course, they were all marked, right? Like you had
those
these
little
marks
dots.
pressed.
Yeah, the little dots.
Yep, little dots all over your fingers. So I just don't even have those. But you know what? I'm looking at my fingers and it's like, I can still see them. It's really interesting.
So they're still, so the mark is still there.
Actually, I do sort of see them. Yeah. Like these are not perfect fingertips. These are not untouched fingertips. I think there's something there I can see. Anyway, but they are very, I don't feel them in the same way that I used to.
Yeah, which would change your kind of sensory experience with a lot of things.
Exactly.
Then I would assume, right?
Exactly. Nice sense of touch. Absolutely.
So one of the things that that connects with too is you were talking about the way that these technologies have changed so dramatically, and especially the norms of which technologies are dominant in a particular moment. And so when we talk about insulin injection, right? So for folks with type 1, it's necessary all the time.
Yep.
Folks with type 2, sometimes all the time necessary as well.
Yep.
But you have talked about and written about the way that shift toward the use of the insulin pump has had serious implications for your kind of everyday life in a lot of ways. But also,
truly.
Also, especially the way that is then communicated to other people and the kind of feedback you get about using devices and things like that. So I guess, first of all, how have those technologies or devices changed for you? And because you talked about the major mind-blowing shift that the CGM was, right? What kind of shift was happening between injections through a syringe or pen and the insulin pump?
Right. So that happened in 2000 for me. So it's been almost 22 years that I've been using an insulin pump. And, pumps had been, around for a while, but they really hit the market hard. Like lots of people were using them by the mid 90s.
Yeah.
I was a grad student up until 2002, but I had access to my spouse's healthcare when he became a professor in 1999. And so I could get an insulin pump, right, without paying, $6,000 out of pocket to get one. And so it was fully covered, which is like a gift. What a gift, man. That was absolutely amazing. I'm always, so happy about that and feel quite lucky. But that really totally changed my life. Going from multiple injections a day, of just like, 3 injections a day, not, it really still pretty much being tied to what was, a very clear daily calendar of when your insulin levels were going to peak, right? So, diabetics' lives used to be, type 1s at least. I'll only speak, I don't know type 2. But type 1 diabetics' lives used to be so routinized because you had to eat when your insulin was peaking in your body. Right. Right? So you'd have these short-acting insulins that, I was using like regular for a long time. So that was going to peak within 4 hours. Right, you give it at breakfast, you have to eat lunch 4 hours later. Right. And if you miss that, you're just going to have incredibly low blood sugar, right? And there's not a lot you can do about that. Yeah, exactly. So it's like so routinized. That stayed with me until 2000. Really, it was still like that. And by 2000 then, I switched to Humalog, which is a very short-acting insulin. I still use Humalog, which means it doesn't peak the ways in which other longer acting, short acting insulins, if I can put it that way. Yeah. Right. Affected you in terms of their peaks. So that just like I could eat when I wanted, not when I had to eat. Right. That's actually incredibly mind-blowing in and of itself. Yeah. And in 2000, my partner saw me order dessert at a restaurant for the very first time because I was using an insulin in a way where I could treat the sugar, right, that was going to hit my system in a way I couldn't do before, right? Like I couldn't do it before with the kinds of insulins I had been using. as well. And so that was really incredible, actually, really incredible. His mind was blown because he'd seen me for, many years not being able to do that. Yeah.
And that's so fascinating the way that because some of these things are kind of what you would consider everyday practices. And folks who don't live with type 1 and, in many ways, those who didn't experience or haven't experienced life without an insulin pump who do live with type 1 don't have that same frame of reference for the way that absolutely dominates the way that you can function in a given day on the most basic level.
That's
right? Yeah. Eating and sleeping, two of the only things we have to do, right, to survive.
Yes.
Right? And they absolutely were dominated by the insulin regimen, right?
Absolutely. Yep. For almost 30 years of my life. Yeah.
Yeah. And so now it's been over 20 years that you've been on an insulin pump, and so that has changed a lot of that. But one of the things that you have written about, and this comes from your recent article in Catalyst, and I'll link this in our show notes for folks to be able to access this as well, because you talk a lot about the way that the decisions around what these things will look like and how they will be used are meant to hide the fact that you are actually performing a medical treatment act.
That's right.
Right. Yeah. And so, how has that kind of stigma around the medicalization of, your existence, really, how has that changed with the kind of shift between devices and how you have existed now with the pager-like insulin pump? Yes. Right?
Yeah, so Benjamin Nothwer, who wrote that piece with me, and who's also type 1 diabetic, I've been wanting to write about diabetes for a while. And I was like, okay, here's someone I could write it with, right? And we had all of these really interesting conversations, and we started to interview each other as well as a way of kind of generating some of these ideas about the ways in which we understand our own relationships to what it means to do diabetes with technology, right?
Yeah.
And what is it to kind of port that technology with us on a day-to-day basis. And, for me, there's about 30 years between our diagnoses.
Wow,
right?
yeah.
Right. So 73 to 2002 or something, I think, for Benjamin. And, I went from a syringe to a pump, it was the technology, the insulin delivery technology is so different, right? I went from this signifier of medical action, a signifier of that, right? It's the syringe clearly communicates that to a pump, which was marketed to me and everyone else, in this market area as something that didn't look like a syringe. Right? You could deliver insulin with something that didn't look like it. In fact, we think it looks like a pager, right? And so that was how it was not only marketed but designed. The very look of insulin pumps, and still a lot of insulin pumps still have this same look. Looks a lot like what pagers looked like in the mid 1990s up until the early 2000s as well. We included in that piece a kind of photo of some direct design comparisons between a Medtronic pump, and a Motorola pager, for instance, that look almost exactly alike. Their screens look alike, their buttons look alike, their color looks alike, their size, their shape, all of this stuff is really, as we say, materializes the metaphor of the pager. It is meant to look exactly like that, and others were meant to look like flip phones at the time, right? They really, again, have the same size, color. Their screens look the same way. Their buttons are in the same place, all of that sort of thing. And, one of the things we were interested in is, okay, why is that the design framework for these things? What is going on and what is being communicated to type 1 diabetics about how they should deliver insulin into their bodies, and how they should relate to those technologies that they're doing that through. And that revealed to us both, like, we were being told to conceal the medical aspects of being a diabetic, of that very medical act of delivering insulin, so that it didn't look like you were delivering insulin. It looked like maybe you were checking a pager and you had to go make a call or something. Or with an insulin pen, which again, they don't look syringe-like either. They actually look like fountain pens. A lot of them are very pretty. They're super colorful. They got designs on them. The like smart pens that are for sale right now are like very fancy looking.
Yeah.
Right. Very, very fancy. Again, to sort of, tell you as a diabetic, you can give insulin without it looking like you're giving insulin.
Right.
Right. And so you can have a kind of cover under these design frameworks, right? Maybe you want to conceal it. And it's also part of that is maybe you should conceal it too.
Right.
Maybe it shouldn't look medical. And for a lot of diabetics, we had already been getting those messages about how we were supposed to, maybe manage our diabetes in private rather than in public. Don't bring out your syringes at, a dinner table or at a restaurant table. I was always like, screw that. I'm doing that. I'm diabetic. Yeah. This is it. I need to put this in my body. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for me. So that's the way it is. I was always like, no.
Yeah, totally. And that's fantastic because for a lot of people, they're basically compelled to go to the bathroom away from everybody else and the actual food. The thing you're doing, you have to go to the bathroom to inject your insulin, right?
And you're going to a bathroom.
Yes.
In like a restaurant, which I would say, like, we're always worried about the cleanliness around. Right. Not that bathrooms are necessarily totally unclean, but it's like you're like using alcohol swabs to make sure everything is actually super clean as you're delivering insulin too. So I always found that, like, go to the bathroom to do that, and you're like, where do you put stuff, right?
Which also carries,
go?
Like, it signifies something totally different, right? Because syringes in bathrooms, when we talk about place and space, a syringe in a bathroom has a totally different type of stigma than the syringe by itself, right?
That's right. Especially, and I, see this here in Montreal and in other cities as well, where, they put in blue lights so that folks can't find veins, for instance, if they're wanting to use intravenous drugs while they're there, right? So to make it really hard to actually use a syringe, for instance, to deliver drugs in a different way. And that's, one of the things too that has, shaped what we call the kind of monitored performance of insulin delivery, which is its association, like the medical association of syringes with IV drug use, right? And all of the kind of moralizing around that and the stigmas around that, and wanting to create distance from that kind of stigma. As again, a kind of reason why you might want to make insulin delivery technologies not look like medical technologies. But they also, one of the things we found too is not only about concealment, which is what so much of the marketing discourse was. Like, we were looking at the early marketing discourse around insulin pens, which is all like, this is going to look exactly like a pen that you would have at work. You can put it alongside your fancy fountain pen. You can discreetly use it. They use the language of discretion as, how you should be relating to what it is to deliver insulin. But they also are training people how to reveal diabetes at the same time.
Yeah.
Because the only way someone's diabetic is when their technology comes out.
Right.
Unless you know what low blood sugar looks like and all of the symptomology around that, which often looks like being someone's
inebriated.
Drunk or inebriated, exactly, right? People look like they've lost their minds in various ways, right?
Yeah.
And so that's also it too, to be able to reveal it and maybe even to self-fashion it as well. So when pumps, when I was first using a pump, there were all these skins you could put on pumps, right? You could put like leopard skins on, sparkly stuff. You could bedazzle your pump, basically.
Yes.
Right? So it looked cool, right? It could look cool. Not somebody to hide, but somebody to be like, look how cool this is. It might look like a pager too, but it's a fancy, shiny one. Right? And that worked really, really interestingly in the context of interactions as a type 1 diabetic too. I had students in a class see my pump on my belt and were like, "Is that a pager?" They really thought it was a pager, right? It actually worked to look like a pager.
Yes.
I can't remember if we wrote about this in the piece, but they thought the little tube was connected to batteries that must have been somewhere in my pants.
Like
so
backup batteries so that it wouldn't run
hilarious. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I absolutely loved that.
You've got to be on call. Okay, this is serious. You never know when the department head is going to need to get a hold of you.
Yeah, no kidding. No, but it was just, we were just like, these are designed, insulin pens and pumps are designed to look like communication technologies, and they're marketed that way, and the patents talk about them that way, and like that is the discourse around these technologies, both their material, like their materiality, like what they are as artifacts, but also the ways in which they're understood, and that was really weird and interesting to us. And those comparisons too, one of the things we talk about is how the pager comparison today seems so obsolete and weird, right? Like this is a very residual technology. I mean, it's being used in hospital settings and stuff. It's very like particular cultural contexts.
Right.
But now it's like, what? That isn't right. For a lot of people, that comparison doesn't work so much because they are such residual technologies, right? They are not something that most people see or are familiar with anymore. And now pumps look more and more like cell phones. Like
so it's like, you're not that kind of doctor, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
But that is interesting because you said that you recently switched insulin pumps, right?
Yeah.
This would have been a couple years ago now, a year and a half ago or so. And that particular insulin pump, because it's the T-Slim, right? Is that what you said?
That's right. Yeah.
Very much designed around the kind of cell phone and smartphone, kind of touch screen smartphone aesthetic, right?
Yes.
So, interesting the way that has changed but stayed the same, right? We have this, it's just another analog for a communication device. Right.
That's right. It's a new skeuomorph, right?
Yeah.
Like it still looks like another technology, right? But this one is different. Now it's a cell phone rather than a pager, right?
Because it doesn't translate.
The structure's still there. That's right.
The other doesn't translate, and this does.
But also, like, what does a desirable technology look like? Like, color screens, for instance, are pretty cool.
And also that glass, the full glass front, right? Because now it's sleek. Now you have all of the ways that cell phone designers talk about the beauty of the device is built into the insulin pump too, right? And having a beautiful object is just as important as having a cool object.
For sure. Absolutely. And I do think they're beautiful.
Legitimately.
I actually like the look of this. Right. Yeah. I was drawn to that in part. As well as, how it could transform my own, like it's automated. So much on this pump is automated, which is also really mind blowing as well.
And totally changes your relationship with insulin and injection too. Right. So that's really interesting. And on this kind of note of relationship, you mentioned that you co-authored this recent piece in Catalyst. And I found that piece really interesting and important, especially some of the ways that you both were talking through the way that you are very kind of hyper conscious of your position related to both diabetes and also these devices. But one of the things that I also find really fascinating is your relationship with each other. Because I know that you have mentioned that you're working on a piece on diabetes kinship, right?
Yep.
And this reads like a mentor kind of relationship with another person with type 1.
Yeah.
And have you ever had that kind of mentorship kind of relationship with someone with type 1?
Right. I'd have more of a peer mentorship relationship too. Right. And which a friend from grad school, again, we were like out at a bar one night and he pulls out his testing equipment and I'm just like, "You're diabetic." I mean, I literally exclaimed, "You're diabetic?"
What?
What? And he was like, "Yeah, why?" I'm like, "Look, I am too," right? Like this revealing of my own technology. And it was like, we're related in some way, right? We're connected.
Yeah.
Just through what we do as diabetics and many of the things, of course, that we have experienced. It's always for me a moment of joy, like great joy when I find out someone else is diabetic, because I have someone I can talk to about diabetes and to share in the experience of it. And for me, it does really feel like a kind of kinship. I feel connected to other people who have type 1 diabetes. And it's like, I may not have anything else in common with them, to be perfectly honest, right? I may not have anything else in common with them. But the fact that, you know, we have this shared set of conditions, as well as what is, you know, a kind of a way of doing things in relationship to our chronic illness, to me that's the kind of grounds of our connection, right? So again, those moments of revelation, those coming out moments, right? Where it's like, here, the tech becomes visible. You see how someone's using it. You're like, oh my goodness, you are also a type 1 diabetic. And that happened with Benjamin and me. When Benjamin, you know, revealed that they were diabetic, I was like, oh my God, right? What? I mean, we already have so much to talk about, right? Like, and we're like working on things together, but that's just like, oh my goodness. And then sort of like, you know, but not everybody feels the same way.
Yeah.
I would say not everybody feels necessarily that connection, though I think one of the things we see on, you know, like Facebook groups for type 1 diabetics, you know, and other kinds of social media spaces where people are talking with each other about being type 1 diabetic, you do see those, right? You see that taking shape. But I've had many experiences where, you know, I've seen someone reveal that they are diabetic, and I've been excited and kind of invite them to talk with me about it, and they have absolutely not wanted to do that.
No interest,
right? Like that's no interest whatsoever. That's something private. They don't, you know what I mean? It's they keep it to themselves more, or that's the response I understand that I was getting, and I never understood it really, even though I know where it comes from. I know exactly where it comes from. It comes from this space of shame that we're supposed to feel shameful, and that we're supposed to keep this private, and that, you know, it's not who we are. Diabetes is something we have, but it's not who you are. And I think there's also that, to these attempts to distance diabetes from identity, right, and how we understand our public and private selves as well. Whereas, I mean, you've heard already, I feel like I was born with diabetes. Right. It's my norm. That's my normal. Always has been. That's what's normal. Always has been. And I think that's really different when people haven't been, you know, diagnosed so early. Right. That those moments of diagnosis and consecutive, you know, all these consecutive experiences that, you know, subsequent, let's put it that way, subsequent experiences, tell them that it's shameful. Tell them that, you know, if something's going wrong with your type 1 diabetes, there must be something wrong with you, that you're not good at this, right? You're doing a poor job of managing your disease. You're somehow, right? It's like, again, a kind of moral judgment on who you are and how you're doing things. And I think, you know, if that is the way in which type 1 diabetes is understood, and we're told to understand it that way, that there are norms around that shape how we live our daily lives and are meant to understand them, the invitation to talk openly with another diabetic may not be seen as something one wants, right? Right. So that has always, I was always sad in those moments myself, but I was also like, I totally respect. Yep. We're not going to have that. It's okay. It's totally okay. They know I'm here. They know I'm here if they want to.
And so not only is diabetes specifically kind of demonized, or there's an association between diabetes and some kind of moral failing, right, in the large scale, but like illness in general, in American culture, illness in general is seen as a moral failing. Absolutely. Because if you're ill, then clearly you didn't, quote unquote, do what you needed to do to be, quote unquote, healthy. And all of that's super like problematic. But that's the framework that even if we're resistant to it, it's still present. And so people have to kind of negotiate it. right? Whether you push back against it or whether you do that pushing privately or publicly, right? It's still got to be negotiated in some way. So
yeah, there's no escaping the fact that you have to negotiate that.
Right.
It's always there. Like, not only do you have to treat yourself as a diabetic, but you also have to navigate, right? These kind of compounding norms, right? That tell you things that you should be, you should feel bad about yourself.
Yeah.
If you're not, if you're having a bad day as a diabetic, if the blood sugars are out of control, whatever it might be.
Yeah, and so out of control. And so then there's all this language built into how you're now using this device, right? It's all about control. It's all about the future of where your blood sugars will be too. And so while the advent of trends from the continuous glucose monitor has absolutely changed the game with how people can live and everything, it also is coding, well, I know that right now, like, I'm quote unquote fine or okay or good, right? This is telling me that I'm double arrowing up, and so I'm not anymore, right?
That's
even though right now I'm okay, I won't be okay, and so therefore I'm still not okay, right?
Right.
So,
I mean, you're describing that feature, right, on the pump like I have, where it tells you, how your blood sugar is doing and where it's going and at what rate, right? And so you get these arrows. When they're straight across, it's like, my blood sugar is staying the same. Awesome. I wake up, when I wake up in the morning and there's like a flat line on my pump showing me what my sugars were, for hours, and it didn't change, and it was all the same.
Yeah.
It's an accomplishment. Yes.
That's the unicorn, as they say.
I'm so happy. I'm so happy.
Yes.
I feel a certain way in relationship, not only to these numbers, right, but to their representation, right?
Yeah.
The ways in which they're graphically presented to me as a way that, I'm supposed to feel about myself too. So those double arrows going up, which is like your blood sugar is going up really fast right now, is like, I really get frustrated at those points too. So, I mean, I think there's more people talking about this in some of the scholarship and, also more in public conversations and on blogs and social media networks about like how people feel about their numbers. Yeah. Right. And you talk about this, right, as data doubles, like this kind of identity that comes from our data and how we're supposed to relate to that as well. And I think there's something to that, right? Like sort of how are we supposed to feel in relationship to our numbers and the identity constructs that often go with those numbers. And I think there's something about that's not just an abstraction of ourselves, but it's actually a representation of ourselves and a way of being. Yeah. And I'm trying to think about that in terms of like, it feels really intimate to me and not just like abstracting or alienating. It feels super intimate and a kind of knowledge that diabetics develop about themselves by the ways they not only quantify themselves, but how that gets tracked and represented back to them as well. And how you feel about that, because I feel very strongly about my numbers.
Well, and so that feeling, maybe that's a place where we can kind of wrap there, because part of what's interesting about a lot of these conversations and the threads that we've kind of woven here is that there are really complicated ways that emotion is evoked or otherwise kind of tied to the chronic illness itself, but the devices and treatments involved in the experience of living with chronic illness too. So is there a kind of space or practice or whatever related to diabetes where there's a space of diabetic joy for you? Because it's kind of a hard space to find.
That's an awesome question, Steve.
Thank you.
I think about, no, it is. No. I mean, I love that question. Yeah. Thinking about what does diabetic joy maybe look like or feel like? And I don't often think about joy in relationship to diabetes. I think about a kind of validation or recognition, like my diabetic anniversaries, right? My anniversaries, whatever word you used. it's sort of like, yes, I've accomplished something. I mean, there's a lot of things that have helped me accomplish that. People, systems, sort of healthcare systems, all of that, right? It's not just me. But there's a kind of recognition of not just survival, but ways of if you can actually find and have the privilege to live well with diabetes, right? I wonder if that's a kind of, I haven't thought about it as joy. I want to think about it a little bit more. Like, what's the pleasure aspect of this, right? Like, and like,
part of why that's interesting.
There's this old blog called like Queering Diabetes. Like, how can we you know what I mean? Like, how can we queer these ways of thinking about diabetes and its treatment, which are actually tied to things like desire and pleasure.
Totally. Yeah. Because that's where I get, that's exactly where this came from, was the kind of queer crip framework of finding joy, but not only finding joy, but producing it too in spaces that have been kind of systemically built to erase it. Or produce other kinds of experiences.
Yeah, and that haven't only been defined by, biomedical institutions for us about what constitutes health and wellness. And that if you don't fit into those norms, you're right, you're not well. Right. And you're not healthy. And that's, I think
code
that's
negative, right? Coded negative. And that's like whatever direction you take it, coded negative. Because I've seen in certain circles of, diabetic Instagram, in some cases diabetic Twitter, where the kinds of diabetes memes and jokes become a space for producing that. And then also joy and pleasure in kind of things in relation to. So I've written before about kind of sex and these devices and how that plays into intimacy between people. But it's also a kind of in between, right? So it's not exactly this. So anyway, something to chew on, maybe. I don't.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of humor, right, that leads to certain kinds of joy around these. That's why I love memes. Some of them are so groan-worthy in relationship to diabetes. I find them like, right. That's why, but others are just like make me laugh. And we talk about Benji and I have talked about that too in relationship to these like outdated skeuomorphs of the the pump is like a pager, and the ways in which people rightly make fun of that, right?
Yeah.
Like that is just ridiculous at this point. And I think there are spaces of joy in that kind of work. Yeah.
So, well, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been fantastic talking with you and having a chance to connect personally in spaces where we've only been able to connect kind of virtually. So it's been a real pleasure. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I loved it. Thanks.
All right. So that conversation was amazing. I have never met Carrie, but I want to meet her now and be diabetic friends.
No, seriously. I mean, you should reach out to her for sure.
I loved how she was talking about when you run into someone and see that they have a device, or you finally realize they have diabetes, and that excitement. And that is how I feel every time.
Yeah.
And I have had those experiences like in the grocery store, or I'm thinking one specific time here in Lafayette where I saw someone had an insulin pump in her pocket. And so I was like, oh, you're diabetic. So am I. And it was like crickets. Look at me weird. I was like all right, you're not excited about this. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not excited about having it either, but like we can connect.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really interesting how different people experience diabetes differently day to day even.
Yeah. No, for sure. And that whole conversation about the way that, the experience with chronic illness and diabetes specifically is such in a lot of ways, all-consuming experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so seeing someone that in whatever way then you can see that they share that experience, I get why it's super exciting.
Yeah. And she talked about that automatic, you just feel like a person because you may know nothing about this person. It's in a grocery store line. But you have this intimate connection because you know what it feels like to have this chronic illness, and it's such a huge part of your life. every single day.
Yeah.
I don't want to say it's a relief, but it's like this sort of, I don't know, it's hard to explain, I guess.
I mean, it's validating at least.
Yeah, it's
right?
like there are other people out there who like experience these things and these feelings and emotions of what it feels like to be this and have this. I liked how she was talking about that kind of distinction between this is who I am, and I have this.
I have versus I am, right? That whole,
Mm-hmm.
and so there's a lot of the conversation there in that moment. There was a lot packed into a very short conversation there about identity, right? Because there were some nods there toward how complex it is to think about something like diabetes as an aspect of one's identity, right? Because on the one hand, like she was talking about, this is literally something that she experiences all day, every day of her entire life.
Yeah.
Right?
How can it
years.
not be this huge part of your identity?
And so, of course, it is to her, right?
Right.
But she also said that she understands, or she can see where it comes from, even though she doesn't personally understand people's aversion to that kind of connection because of all that stigma associated with
not
the
having
diagnosis.
it define you, and there's this weird sort of, I don't know, influidity, is that a word?
Influidity, I like it. We can make up words here. That's what I do for a living. You know that, right?
Can I get paid for that? I don't know. She also, how she was talking about, she was diagnosed at 1. So we were kind of talking about how different it is to be diagnosed at different ages and people being diagnosed at 50 or 20, or, I was diagnosed at 9. And for me, that was kind of at a time where you are starting to feel embarrassed about things and starting to realize, people teasing you about different things, or that you're different, or, I was in 3rd grade and I remember I was diagnosed in February, 25 years ago this February, actually. And when I went back to school, my teacher was really great and she sat the class down and we had this conversation. I wish I could remember more clearly about sort of the conversation that we had when she was explaining to the class my diagnosis. And I know there was some weird pushback from this one kid in my class who I wish I could remember more specifics. I'll have to think through it more. But her telling the class, she's no different from you. She has this, chronic illness, but, that doesn't, make her different, which is kind of hilarious because, it does make you different. But I think what she was trying to do, and this is me obviously analyzing it as an adult now, but as a child, that felt good to, have it talked about. It wasn't this let's keep it under the table secret thing, which for most of my life I was trying to hide it, trying to just not have it brought up and not have it discussed. And I don't really know what that I know what that stems from. That's a much longer conversation of, experiences that I've had. But I just thought that was interesting. When you're diagnosed at 1, you were talking about not having the sense of before. Before diabetes.
Before. Yeah. And a part of that, and there's been a lot of really, I think, important kind of disability studies, work, and writing related to this very question and phenomenon of the experience before and the imaginary future of a post chronically ill or post disabled life. Yeah. And that's a really problematic framework that erases what that experience actually is right now, right? Because there is a mourning for that which was lost and the yearning for a future that isn't my experience now. And it's not, when I say it that way, it makes it feel like it's just an individual process. But part of what I think she was getting at with how these devices are like inscribed with meaning is that we are trained to think about ourselves in particular ways, right? And so it's not about an individual just quote unquote feeling this way. It's that we are actually kind of compelled to feel this way because it's not like socially acceptable to be ill.
Yeah. And, talking about hiding in the bathroom to do shots or, those things that were sort of, ooh, don't do that in front of me, or the uncomfortable people being uncomfortable witnessing you doing this thing that sustains your life, and how ridiculous that sounds on like talking about it. But, we've all been in that experience where someone says something to us that is intrinsically like defining to you.
Yeah.
I would never marry someone with diabetes because then our kids would have diabetes. Like someone said that to me in high school and it was traumatic for me. And, this person probably doesn't remember that they said this.
Sure.
I'm almost certain,
Of course.
But to me, that was this, oh, are people not going to want to be with me because of this? And, that sort of thought process in defining yourself and, your self-worth and all those things, all because of this thing that you have,
That's
this
completely
chronic illness.
outside of anyone's control.
Yep.
Right? There's no decision made to live a chronically ill life. That's not a decision people make, right? And so it's an arbitrary thing that is specific to your experience, but it's coded as socially unacceptable, right? And that's where she gets at the language of the morality of health versus illness, of able-bodiedness versus disability, and all of that framed in terms of a moral experience is how all of this super problematic stuff gets inscribed onto people.
Yeah.
Because if it's moral, then there are significant impacts on how we exist in this world and how it's received by others, right? It codes everything we do. So one of the other things that she talked through here that I found really interesting was the way that she narrated the change in testing technologies.
Wow. I'd never heard of testing, like urine testing blood sugars.
Yeah, which is really interesting because that was a standard for many, many decades.
Yeah.
Prior to the use of blood in testing.
Sure.
Have you ever used a like color-coded strip kind of testing thing?
So not blood sugars, ketone tests.
Oh, right.
Which when I was diagnosed was very big. It was like you should be doing this all the time to see if you have ketones, and it never really made sense to me as a kid, and I don't think I don't know. I don't think as a kid in the 90s, that there was a lot of conversation with the doctor to me, like explaining these things. It was like they were talking to my parents. And wow, I've never really thought about that before until I just mentioned that. But so, when you're a kid, it's a lot of talking to the parents and what this is. And so, a lot of the times you probably zone out or, they're not talking to me. They're talking to my parents about this stuff. But ketone testing just didn't make sense to me. And it's probably because it was like, okay, what color is it? And, is it like in this upper range that you shouldn't be in? Or I don't know. we never really used that as sort of a basis of testing.
Yeah.
And I remember.
And part of that that I find really interesting is that as she was talking through, she was diagnosed in the 70s, right? And it wasn't until the 1980s that using blood was even a thing at home.
That's crazy.
They had blood testing materials in hospitals, specifically in clinic situations, for a couple of decades. This would have been in the 60s at least when dextrose sticks became a thing. So her entire kind of framework there at the beginning was not the numbers.
Yeah.
Right? The scale was based on color and then they mapped colors onto numbers. And they said, okay, so this color means that you're kind of in this range.
Yeah.
Right.
I was thinking about this, how horrifying, I think about what it would be like to be a parent of an infant.
Yeah.
Literally an infant, and trying to guess, okay, so like, what do we feed this child? And I'm really curious as to like how that was done. How do you, you don't have any basis for, and it's delayed.
Mm-hmm.
So these tests that you're taking are delayed. And also, how do you get a baby to pee on a whatever,
Well, and so that was interesting because the way she talked through it, now it kind of makes sense because originally the medium they were using was like a tape. And so she was saying you would pee on the tape. So I'm guessing they would
stick
like
that in the diaper,
swipe it across the urine that was in the diaper. That would be my guess because
so
you can't like time
hold
when
the
your
child
baby
over.
pees.
There are people who do that. That's really fascinating to me. How scary. I mean, for any parent to have a child with diabetes, it's scary because you are not the one experiencing what they're experiencing. And, but you're constantly worried about the well-being and safety of your child. So, I mean, we're going to have some interesting conversations about that in future episodes because.
Yeah, I mean, the experience of a parent in relation to your child's diagnosis, that's a whole other side of the experience of living with diabetes. Right? Yeah, there's personal experience with living with the diagnosis yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But for people who are direct caregivers, that's a whole other thing. The other side of this conversation about testing that I found really interesting is the way that she talked about how very early on, and then now the last couple of years since she got a CGM, the testing is based on something that is other than blood from your body.
Yeah, the interstitial
fluid. And before that, it was urine. And both of those are delayed representations, right, of where your body was, not necessarily where your body is at a particular moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so she went this span of 30 or so years with, I mean, probably more than that, right? It was probably more like 40. I'm overestimating. I think it's in around 30 years there where she was testing her blood directly.
Yeah, I think about how strange that is. I still test my blood to calibrate my sensor, which is, depending on if my sensor's functioning correctly and if I'm paranoid about how I'm feeling and stuff. But I imagine it would be for, testing your blood for so many years and then not doing it would be a very strange feeling.
Yeah.
Just like anything else in your life that you suddenly aren't doing anymore. There's this system of doing things that, would be interrupted. And
yeah. And so your whole way of understanding your body and what's happening changed.
Yeah. And so while it's freeing and great to not have to prick your finger and worry about doing this all the time, I imagine there's a lot of mixed feelings about what's happening.
Sure. I mean, at the very least, you have to find ways to adjust, right? Because you have to totally, not have to, but it does totally change how you're interacting with this.
And there's something strange about trusting a blood sugar that you do on a test versus trusting a sensor. And for me, I don't know why there's that discretion of doing my blood test seems like, oh, this is like, okay, this is for sure. But then on the sensor, I'm like, well, is this
that question of accuracy?
Correct? Yeah.
How well the representation
so there's this weird
actually matches.
sort of trust relationship with devices.
Wow.
That is really fascinating. Steve's now thinking, paper. About this.
No, bring that up. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Right? That you trust the meter more than you trust the CGM. And that's really fascinating.
Which is weird because the CGM has been this great freeing thing.
Yeah.
But it's also been really frustrating too in a lot of ways when it's not correct. And like when it's not correctly calibrated or when it's having issues calibrating, it's just like, ugh. And maybe it's because I've been doing blood testing for years. And so I'm familiar, and it's like, okay, this is what my blood sugar is. But there is that weird trust scenario going on. I don't really know.
Yeah. I mean, the meter, the finger prick is like a well-worn hat, right? You get a new hat. Sometimes it feels a little weird, even if you like it.
Oh my
God. But that might be a dumb analogy. But that's really interesting. And it does go back to this point, though, that the CGM is not reading your blood glucose. It is reading glucose levels in the fluid below your skin.
Yeah.
It's not blood. And then there are algorithms written into the device that are translating what it's reading and then estimating what you are now. So it reads where you were, basically, and then estimates where you are now. So it is inherently a process that is like once or twice removed further than the finger prick, right? That the proximity to your actual blood being tested changes some of that. That's really fascinating. Oh my gosh, trust. Device trust, that's so fascinating. And this conversation about trust, I think, is interesting in relation to a different side of this conversation I had with her, because we referenced this paper that she co-authored in Catalyst, and we'll link this, like I mentioned before, in our show notes, but they talk about the way that the design, the way people decided on how they were going to actually like build these devices were built to mimic the way that other devices already looked and were used, but especially communication devices that people were already familiar with.
It is kind of funny that the tech and look of devices is just finally sort of changing in some ways, because, the pager look is so ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I have really had people ask me if I have pagers, and it's like, what? Like, I guess people in the medical field still have reference for pagers because I think they still sort of use similar tech in like hospitals and stuff like that. But it's
pretty
just
much
funny.
The only space now.
It's just funny, like people who even know me, I'm like, why would I have a pager? Like, what a weird thing to ask someone in this decade, Like, is that a pager? Yeah. Let me just page the hospital. I'm on my way,
Let me answer this page from 30 years ago. Thanks. No.
Especially like pagers were on the out by the time our kind of age group was around. So we didn't ever use pagers personally. But there are people, the decade before us who actually used pagers. So I'm sure that's kind of a weird.
Yeah, of course. Thing. Pagers were big in the late 80s into the 90s. They were the thing. That's why these designers were like, oh, this is a hot design. We got
That's why it's so weird. I guess it's expensive to, change what they look like, but it just seems with how much money they're, funneling in but this devices.
That's actually really interesting.
Like change the look of it, right? I'm a designer, and like the look of things, I tried not to decide on which insulin pump to get based on the looks, but then I'm thinking, why? Like, why did I do that? Because I want it to look cool. I want it to feel good when I'm holding it. And, there's something about that kind of user experience that.
Totally. Like she was saying, you want it to be desirable.
Right.
Right? Because if this thing's going to be connected to you and you're going to be engaging with it every day, basically all day long, it should be something that you like and enjoy. But also what you're talking through highlights some of the complexities of like technological design over time. And the way that a design can become normalized or almost synonymous with certain practices. And so, it's really hard to move away from the design of the mini-med, let's say, that because it was decades long that they had this pager design that was exactly mimicking what a pager looked like, with the little screen above and the couple of little buttons below.
Mm-hmm.
But moving away from that design has a lot of implications.
Right.
Right? People know that device. They know how it works. They know how to interact with it.
Mm-hmm.
They are comfortable.
Right.
And so when you're decades deep in using a particular design, it can actually be kind of detrimental to the sales. I mean, we're thinking pragmatically.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
I'm thinking when I got this new version of the Medtronic pump, I did kind of want to try something new, but this is what I knew. This is what had the closed loop system was very useful in how I was treating my
really exciting.
Yeah. And so, I stuck with it because it was familiar and I felt safe because it was offering me what I needed.
Right.
So it's interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And then the subtle side that she talked through there and the ways that because these are very consciously being designed to reflect what a communication device is doing or what a person is doing, they're doing work. We can frame it that way.
Yeah.
People who are using communication devices like that, fountain pens and beepers, we are talking about people usually engaged in labor.
Yeah.
Right. And so not only is it training us to think about this treatment as not medical because of stigmas and things associated there, but it's also involved in trying to portray that you are working. Right? And that's a whole other can of worms. And so we can come back to that another time.
Well, that wraps up episode 4. I feel like we barely scratched the surface of what we wanted to talk about, but hopefully we did some justice
but that
to
leaves
Carrie's
room
interview.
So that you all can engage the conversation with us. Hop on over to Instagram, comment on some of these posts. Let us know what you think too. But this was our conversation about mini garlic naan and our discussion with Dr. Carrie Rentschler from McGill University. Thank you all for listening. Make sure that you head over to Instagram and follow us if you haven't. Like and subscribe on whichever of your streaming services you prefer. And if you're feeling so inclined, go ahead and give us a rating. Spotify just added a rating feature. That's super complicated right now because of all the stuff going on with Spotify. We're not going to talk about that because this is also on Spotify. But thank you all very much, and we will see you next week.